Bill went to town a while
Something
ago.
like that. Anyway, I haven't played
Yeah.
in a long time. That kind of stuff.
Your song. No, that was.
Okay, okay, Dennis, we received orders on the 21st of April 1954 for Dad to go to Edwards Air Force Base. He was going along with Colonel Vostell, who had been his boss, and asked him to come with him. And then we arrived at Edwards Air Force Base in Kern County, California on the 12th of May 1954. Tell a little, anything you can remember about the early part there when we actually moved there.
I can't. It just doesn't come up. For some reason, that period is kind of a blank. I think it was so eclipsed by our experience in Japan afterwards that I kind of just didn't retain a lot. I don't have a lot of memories. I don't. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we lived at 1350 Boyd Avenue.
Yeah.
Tell a little bit about that, the property, the house, the compound, the kids, clothes, toys we got, whatever. The Hopalong Cassidy outfits, if you want.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a visual picture in my mind of the house on the edge of the desert, and I remember the pet turtle we had and how plentiful horned toads were in the desert. Although now they're an endangered species, apparently they're dying off. But yeah, there was always plenty of horned toads around to pet them. You pet them on the top of their head, and they let you pet them, and play with them. And I remember some of the kids in the neighborhood. I think this is when Phil was more coming into his own as a person, and his memories start to come on strong. I do remember that they finally got around to fixing that hernia that they didn't fix when I fell on my head when I was a kid. And the reason they did it was the hernia strangulated, and it would have gone into gangrene had it been left. And so I was a pretty sick puppy when I went into the hospital. And the doctor that saved me, according to Mom, was the first black surgeon in the U.S. Air Force.
Dr. Watson.
Yeah, was that his name, Dr. Watson?
Mm-hmm.
But Mom brought me a model kit of a stagecoach in the hospital. I remember that. And I was sitting there in the bed painting it when I tip over my paint, and I totally stained the whole top of the hospital furniture, and it wouldn't come out. Nothing I could do would get the paint out. So I came home, recovered, and the hospital had a slightly discolored piece of furniture. They probably threw it away eventually. But yeah, we'd go into Lancaster to shop, and I can remember going in for an Armed Forces Day thing that they had in Lancaster, and they had a Sherman tank parked right out there in the middle of this thing, and all the kids were scrambling to get in, and I wanted to get in that so bad. I climbed up on it, and I hovered over the hatch by the gun and waiting for enough kids to come out. But every time I tried to get in, another kid would push by me or push out, and I never got inside that Sherman tank. And I don't know why it meant so much to me, but for years I felt deeply cheated because I didn't get to go down inside the Sherman tank and and sit at the controls and that kind of thing. That's one memory. In those days you could buy toy soldiers in Lancaster at the store for $0.10 a piece. Remember that?
$0.10 a piece.
And they were really well molded. I mean, they were so well molded that I have seldom seen. It was probably in about a 1/32 scale. I've never seen Civil War soldiers so well molded and so well detailed from many sources since then. For some reason, not only were they cheap, but they were exceptionally well detailed and well made soldiers. And so we played that. I remember took a spell where we were buying Army soldiers. I can remember sitting out between, not our house, but there was our house, there was a row of houses, and there was a break between, and then another row of houses. And there was an area up there that was kind of muddy. I remember digging trenches and playing with toy soldiers in these muddy trenches. But it wasn't Civil War. That was U.S. soldiers. They just, I guess there's, and it's interesting because apparently this was done in the U.S. It was also done extensively in Scandinavia, but they came up with a procedure to what they thought would shrink adenoids, and it involved radiation. In those days, you know, the atomic bomb was only what 8 or 9 years in the past, and they were still playing with atomic energy like it was a toy, you know. And so they basically experimented on a lot of American kids. In fact, it wasn't until a very recent presidential administration that the American government apologized to the American people. In fact, for the experiments that they had done on their children. It actually came out as a formal presidential policy. But they sent me off to Bakersfield to this doctor. I can't call him a quack because he probably had some skills. Maybe he was just totally believing this stuff. But they had me lay on my back on a gurney, and they took these long wooden sticks with cotton on it, like an elongated cotton swab or a Q-tip, and they dipped it in this pasty radium. I mean, it's just a radium form, and they put it in my nostril, shoved it all the way to the back of my head, and I had to lay there perfectly still for 20 minutes. And then they took it out, and they did the other side, dipped it in radium, stuck it all the way back to the back of my, and left me for 20 minutes. We went back to Bakersfield. It was a long drive from Edwards to Bakersfield, through the Tehachapies and all that stuff. We went back 3 different times and had that procedure done to me. And there's interesting, there's been studies made where immune systems were compromised in people. Some people got cancer from it. I'm not sure if I ever suffered any noticeable effects from it, but I sure got the treatment, you know, moment in time.
Well, they didn't know what they're about. They even had machines where you could put in a dime and you could see your bones
your
stand
feet.
on it and
Yeah.
up through your feet.
I remember those. I never had my...
I never stood on
actually.
one,
No.
but it just seemed, even to me, even then it seemed a little risky, so we never did it. But they had them, and kids stood on those things.
And I remember a visit we had from Uncle Hess, and the 2 girls. There was
Cindy and Candy.
Cindy and Candy. That's right.
And Aldine.
Yeah, and right, she was there. And I remember the day they visited with us, and and a story of Phil's faux pas, which I will never repeat.
Yeah, I did have a faux pas, didn't I? Didn't know you remembered it, but I did.
Oh boy, did I! Well, it was within 10 minutes of that they packed up and left. They were so mortified, you know. But was that them or
That
was
that wasn't my, well, that was one faux pas. My worst faux pas was when Uncle Buddy's family came.
That's who it was.
And I think it was Ike.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
won't
No,
discuss that one either.
It wasn't with Uncle Hess's family. It was with...
No, but I had a faux pas on the other one, which was a minor little thing. I thought you were talking about that minor little thing, but
No.
oh yeah, that one was
Never to repeat it.
yeah.
So all I can say is, descendants will just have to guess what happened.
Yeah, that was
Yeah, the
Uncle.
mind will go wild.
That was Uncle Buddy's. Yeah.
Yeah. And
off camera, I'll tell you guys what happened.
no, you don't have to. I mean, you know,
I'm curious.
Yeah. And I can remember, you know, not much. It's funny because I have almost zero memories of school there. Nothing. I don't think I was particularly happy during that period of time. I do remember probably the best thing that happened to me in that time period. It was Aunt Lizzie took Johnny, my cousin Johnny Campbell, and myself to Disneyland.
GB.
Was that GB? I thought it was Johnny. See,
No, it was GB and you, and I have a picture of the day you went.
yeah. Well, see, that's the problem. My memories of that period are just very, very foggy.
Yeah. You left from Downey.
Is that right? I don't even know where we left from.
And
Yeah.
whenever you were done, she dropped him back up at Downey.
Yeah.
And then you guys went down to Chula Vista.
I know one thing. You certainly felt left out.
Oh yeah.
You ought to see the picture.
But yeah, it was the second day it was open. She couldn't get tickets for the first day, so she got it for the second day. Mouseketeers all over the place. I remember that. A lot of rides that are no longer there. I remember the 20,000 League Under the Sea, which I always thought was a cool movie. Going through the movie set, it wasn't the submarine. It was a movie set. You know, it was kind of open in the big eyeball window, and you know, from the movie set. I thought that was cool.
We moved that to France.
Yeah.
You can still see that in France.
That's what I've heard. So far I'm doing pretty poorly. So it wasn't Uncle Hess's family. It was somebody else, and it wasn't Johnny. It was GBC. That's how poor my memory is of that period.
Well, yeah, let's talk about something. You talked about the hernia operation, and
Yeah.
you did have that. You actually you like baseball. In fact, Aunt Lizzie sent you some money, and you bought a ball and bat, and you were playing with it. And you signed up to play Little League, and you were chosen by the Oaks. And you were a catcher for the Oaks.
Well, I'm glad that you remember that.
But because of the surgery, you had to quit. And you never really played.
I never played sports after
Yeah,
that.
after that. But you were a good athlete.
But I remember I even got issued it was a gray wool uniform.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember smelling it and holding it in my hands, but I had to turn it back in because I was not allowed to play. And that was the end of my sports interest. That was it. I never was interested in sports again. I figured I closed the door and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
In 1954, you mentioned Aunt Lizzie one of the Dr. Seuss books. And I remember you started, I think, with McElligot's Pool and what was there was two of them that were at the beginning.
Oh, there was scrambled egg super, and there was I remember McElligot's Pool. But I must have read 4 or 5 at that time. They were all had come out one after the other, and once I was on to the first 2, I remember reading 4 or 5 of the titles, although I can't tell you what the other ones were.
Well, the first 2 were I think that I saw it on Mulberry Street.
I remember that.
And McElligot's Pool. And then you had If I Ran the Zoo, If I Ran the Circus, If I Ran, there was just a bunch of them.
Yeah.
But I remember you reading it. You also, you were older than me, and so you would read things that I wasn't reading. For example, there was a book about a children's version of The Pearl of Great Price. And I remember you and Mom reading that, for example. So you were starting to do academic things that were
I don't remember.
above your age, actually.
I don't remember. That whole period of Edwards was a wash. I just have almost no memories of it at all.
Mm-hmm. You went back to Aunt Lizzie's and you stayed with her for a while. Tell about the models.
Oh, well, she got me it was the very first early car models, and I think they were 32nd scale, and I put together 4 of them. I remember one was a Stutz Bearcat. I can remember, I've actually got the models in my closet in right now in this house, but I'd have to go look at you, and even then they weren't labeled, so I'm not sure I could tell you what they are without going to a reference book. Yeah, Edwards is a bust for me. I just don't have any significant memories of Edwards.
Did we talk on camera last night about that pool pond that would form in the winter? And on camera about the fort that the kids had built on the edge of the desert? Remember we'd attack it and they'd come out and move in their lines? Do you remember that?
Yeah, they'd ride until finally they were. And then I remember one time going way out in the desert, and I don't know if you were with me, but what we found were 2 wooden walkways, like planks, and as if there had been some kind of a little town out in the desert, and behind the walkways were these holes in the ground with all these collapsed wood into it. It was like a western town where the wooden sidewalk still remained, but all the buildings had collapsed. And I remember that we actually went and dug underneath those sidewalks and created a little bit of a fort, some of the older boys and I, under these sidewalks. Always looking for snakes. We were always afraid we were going to run into rattlesnakes. That's a memory I have. But boy, I tell you, I don't have much of a memory of Edwards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you remember a time when we got on a bus and we rode all the way into Los Angeles to the Pan Pacific Auditorium, where we saw a movie, probably the Ten Commandments, and it was in CinemaScope.
CinemaScope Technicolor, yeah.
Do you remember doing that?
Now that you mention it, I can remember going in and seeing that. Yeah. Was it the Ten Commandments we saw? I think
I
so.
wasn't sure it was, but it's the right date for the Ten Commandments because it came out in '57.
Yeah, it could be. Could be.
Mhm.
Actually, I ought to let you just tell the camera about it because I really don't remember.
Mhm. The Hopalong Cassidy outfits. What about
Well, we both got them,
them?
as I recall, and you wore yours to rags, and I think I ended up giving you mine so you could wear it to rags.
You did. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. They had long sleeves. Mom was very happy that they had long sleeves because we loved them so much we wore them. And we were out in that desert and that long sleeves protected our arms from the sun. And so she was real happy with that, but she was unhappy with me because mine would get dirty and she'd take it, put it in the laundry, and I'd take it out of the laundry and put it back on again dirty for the next day.
Yeah. I remember trying to climb a Joshua tree, which is a revelation.
Oh,
Number
you
one,
don't want to do that.
they're not very strong. They break very easily. Number two, the points point down to when you're trying to climb up, you're getting stabbed. Getting down was easy, you just slid down. But that was an unsuccessful attempt. I remember trying to climb one.
Dad sold Renaware pots and pans and also silverware, and we'd go. Do you remember learning to embroider?
I know Mom showed me at some point in time how to do that. That's about all I remember.
He'd be inside selling pots and pans, and we'd be outside embroidering in the car.
No, I don't remember.
Okay, let's talk about Bob. Bob, about the time that we were going to Japan, he was placed in Camarillo State Hospital.
Yeah.
Talk a little about that, perhaps.
Well, that was quite a way to drive once, and we went up to visit him. It was only within the years before we went, or so before we went to Japan, that he was in there, and I can remember going up. I remember going into the town of, which was close to Camarillo, and Dad would buy bags of the cheapest hamburgers he could buy, and I think they were 19 cents a piece at the time, and we'd have lunch with eating hamburgers, and then we'd go. There was a park to where we would go, and Bob could run, and we would run too. But actually, I liked those hamburgers. They were great. You know, I don't. You know more about this than I do.
Okay, talk about Donna Tompkins.
Well, yeah, she was sweet on me. I was actually sweet on her, but it was my sworn duty as a guy to run away from her. You know, to get kissed by a girl was sort of like, I don't know, being tagged by a ghost or something. You know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, now when we arrived in Edwards, Colonel Vostell's Toy Fox Terrier had pups, and Dad actually arranged when he asked him if he wanted a pup. Colonel Vostell actually sent a plane back to Holloman Air Force Base to pick up a pup and bring it out for us.
Yeah. RHIP, right? Rank has its privilege.
Yeah.
Who else could do that? But
Talk about Corky.
Well, I don't remember much about Corky in that phase. I don't. And I always wondered how he got hurt his foot. How did that happen? Do you remember? Remember how he limped? He had one foot in the air. How did that happen?
I don't know.
Did he come to us like that with an injured foot?
I don't believe so. I don't know.
He certainly had an injured foot when we left him with Aunt Lizzie, right?
That I don't remember either. I do remember him at one time having one, but I didn't remember it as a permanent condition.
It was a permanent condition.
Yeah.
He always limped around with that one foot in the air. Yeah.
What about Herta and Frank Ridenauer? Herta was an interesting character.
Well, all I knew about it at the time was that she was married to an airman, and that she, I guess, had fled before the Russians, I guess, packed a suitcase and just packed it full of cheese and meat, salamis and this sort of stuff. She must have had either a husband or a boyfriend, because on her couch there was did you remember that little stitched doll? It was a doll of a soldier. It was kind of done about this tall, but the little stuffed soldier was wearing a German uniform. So she must have made that during the war and must have put that in the suitcase. That must have escaped with her. It wasn't an airman. It was a little stuffed doll of a German soldier. So she probably either lost a husband or a boyfriend or something in the war, and kept that. And her husband didn't mind that she kept it. But I remember that little soldier sitting on her couch, that Southern soldier, you know. And I always figured there was probably a very tragic story behind that, but I was not to know why that was so.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you talk about Michael Murray and his dad on camera yesterday?
Well, Michael Murray was a friend of mine in school. I hated school. I didn't get along well. I didn't have many friends. My grades plummeted, just plummeted. But he was somebody that I could go over to his house and play, and we'd climb the trees and whatnot. And so Michael lost his grip and plummeted down. Oh, it must have been 8-10 feet to the ground at least, and broke his collarbone. I do remember that. Of course, that's the period when I gave up sports. That's the period when I had the surgeries. That's the period when I don't know. I think for some reason my self-esteem went through the floor during the Edwards period. And I blocked it. I just blocked it. There were some things that went on that were very painful for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hey, your brother Michael Allen Wheeler was born the 28th of July, 1954, there at the hospital there at Edwards. Talk a little bit about Mike, if you would.
Well, a new baby. I had a big round face like me. I recognized that immediately. You know, I had a face that would profile perfectly over a moon. You know, big round face. You know, and Michael had one too. And I kind of decided he was going to be my baby in a way. I kind of adopted in a way Michael. In fact, even up to the time I was grown and went into the Army, Michael was always my little pal along. I used to take him to thrift stores with me. When got him his first guitar and all that stuff, but that comes later. But I kind of claimed Michael. Neil, having claimed Michael, Neil didn't get as much attention from me, but Michael was special to me as a baby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Neil was born on the 26th of June, 1956. There also at the 65th 510th Air Force Hospital at Edwards. Talk a little bit about Neil, if you will.
All I can remember is that he was a muscular little guy, very fit little guy. You know, the kind of guy, if he worked out, he could have been an Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of. He's a tight, wound, muscular little baby. And to think of him now is difficult, what's going on now. But I didn't have that closeness with him that I had with Michael. I remember I was always getting bit by those crazy red ants in our yard, which were everywhere. And I got bit so many times that I finally realized that when they bit me, it didn't hurt very much anymore. I think I developed an immunity somewhat to red ants living there at that time. I had been bitten so many times by them that my memories are so sketchy there, Phil. They're so sketchy.
Okay, let's in 1957, the spring of 1957, Dad received orders to go to Japan. He had put in for Germany. You could have a first, second, and third choice, and it came back Japan. So that was a disappointment to him. But we didn't go to Japan immediately. Mother could have gone with him, but they'd had to stay 4 years. He could have gone alone for 18 months, and we wouldn't have gone at all. He took the middle option, which was that he went for 6 months, and then we would come and be with him for 2.5 years, a total of 3 years. And so that's what he chose, and that's what we did. So we went to live with Aunt Lizzie.
Yeah, now that I remember. It seems like I was happier living with Aunt Lizzie. I'm not exactly sure why Edwards is such a blank, but Dad was pretty scary to me, I think, at that point in life. He was a pretty stern disciplinarian, and that may be part of why I blocked so much of Edwards. I got a lot of punishment, as I recall, you know. But being with Aunt Lizzie, I do remember we actually moved in with her in her new house. You know, it was a small house, and I'm not sure where Neil and Michael fit into that house, because you and I were in the one bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember Aunt Lizzie would always make us take our socks off before we go to bed. We couldn't go to bed with our socks on. And I was always bugged me because I'd always left my socks on before that time. But I went to a school called Lillian J. Rice. I remember that. And I remember they had school lunches. It wasn't too far a walk from our house. Oh, Aunt Lizzie's house, of course. I remember getting sicker than a dog on orange juice, little cardboard cartons of orange juice. I think one of them was tainted. I got really sick, and it was years before I would drink orange juice again because of that incident at Lillian J. Rice. But walking home from school, there was a little store right on the corner of was that 3rd Avenue, was it? And we could stop and get candy if we had a little extra money. Wacky plaques, baseball cards were the things that you really liked. I liked the wacky plaques too. And you mentioned the other day about going to see a movie in a bus. Now, it might have been earlier. It wasn't before we went to Japan. It might have been earlier because I don't remember if we walked from Church Street or we walked from the one up. But a bus, a regular full-size bus, would come into the neighborhood, and you give them a dime, and you would get on board the bus, and you'd watch a series, mostly cartoons. And then you'd get off the bus, and the bus would go to the next neighborhood. But the kids would flock on the bus. I can remember, at least a dozen or more kids getting on that bus to watch cartoons. And boy, something like that wouldn't go today, would it? I mean, kids in the dark watching cartoon with a stranger on a bus. I mean, all the buttons would get pushed on that one.
Mm-hmm.
But it was kind of neat. I remember we made friends with, well, first of all, there was a Hispanic kid whose family lived in the big house, in Grandma and Grandpa's old house.
Mm-hmm. Which was next door.
Yeah, and I can't remember his name, but I can remember singing that song, "Oh donde, oh donde, oh donde mi perro, oh donde," you know, where's
my dog?
Yeah, in Spanish. And I remember somebody had given him a gift of a box of all these wood-carved tanks. You remember that? There was dozens of them, and they were actual wooden-carved models of Shermans and German tanks and British tanks. They were actually pretty well made, but I remember him dumping that box out and us playing with those in the yard there between Aunt Lizzie's and the other house. I also remember the neighbors right next door. What was his name? He'd been in the Navy, an old Navy guy.
Yeah, Kitty.
What was their last name? Do you remember?
Yeah, I do. But
Start with an M or something.
Mayor.
Mayor. The Mayors.
Kitty Marin, yeah.
And him, and he had some of these big gray boxes full of battleships.
Battleships.
And he had a box of them full of Japanese battleships and American battleships. And I remember opening those things up and playing with them on his coffee table. But then if we went 2 doors down then he had a grandson who was living there with him. And then if you went 2 more doors down, there was another boy that lived there. And so between you and I and the Mayor boy and this other boy, we would play Civil War. Right then, Civil War was very, very popular, and we played Yankees and Rebels and we'd charge. We'd have these magnificent charges, and then we'd be shot and we'd fall. We'd throw our bodies on the ground like we'd just been shot. And the one who was the best at doing that was the mayor boy, and he was later killed in Vietnam.
We did that on Gary's front lawn, never on Aunt Lizzie's front lawn. We always went down there. That was kind of the battlefield.
Was the boy's name Gary?
They had a Jeep.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we would go across that lawn incessantly
Yeah.
in charges.
Charges, yeah. But the mayor boy was killed in Vietnam later. I remember that. By that time, you and I, we actually did go to Disneyland, because I can remember we had our little Yankee and Rebel hats, and of course that was a perfect thing to play Civil War in the front yard with, you know, the little keppies and that sort of thing.
We went there just on the way up to San Francisco. We had already been at Edwards too, by the way, so that was our third trip.
Okay.
But we got those, and I had my kepi, my Rebel kepi, and you had the cowboy style hat.
Yeah.
And I had that kepi the whole time I was in Japan. I have pictures of me wearing that in Japan.
Yeah, I remember that kepi.
There's a picture of me next to Airman Brown, who was African American, and my gray kepi with my gray sweater, and his wife, who was Japanese.
Yeah, well, I remember them very well.
But yeah, but we did go to there.
I remember when we got ready to go to Japan, we went up to San Francisco, and we actually stayed in the town of San Francisco in a military housing of some sort, barracks of some sort, before we left for Japan. So we actually stayed in the town of San Francisco. And then we flew out of, did we fly out of Travis? I can't remember. Or was it a commercial airline? It was called Slick Airways.
Okay, we were there with Aunt Lizzie from April to September, and of course April was Easter. And we went to a feed store, and I'll let Dennis continue. At the feed store we got.
Well, you're prompting me. I don't remember doing that. I know we got some chickens, baby chickens, and we raised them up, and ultimately ate them. Not with our permission. It was done sort of clandestinely. You know, we ate the chickens. And I remember going up to Uncle Jack's house and visiting with him. He was such a character, you know, he was such a comedian in some ways. He liked to make jokes. And I remember Cousin Rocky. I can remember even having a barbecue in their backyard. And, what fascinated me about Uncle Jack was all the stuff that he had liberated in Europe during the Second World War. I mean, on the top shelf in his little study, there was visored helmets. I mean, medieval visored helmets, and swords, crossed swords, dueling pistols. Goodness gracious! I'm not sure what he did, whether they liberated some local museum or not, as they pushed through France and Germany. But he had an incredible collection of things, which always fascinated me. And then he'd given Rocky his World War I German helmet, you know, and I remember that thing. And so being around families that had military backgrounds, I mean, almost all the men of that generation had served in World War II in one capacity or another. So I was always kind of bombarded with these stories and mementos kind of things, and it's probably why I got into collecting military stuff at some point in time. You know, so it did have a profound influence on me. And in those days, I think Uncle Jack was still working at Convair. I remember he worked at Convair in San Diego, you know, the big aircraft airframe outfit. I remember Uncle Ellis and Aunt Mary, but probably not so much as you did. For some reason, you stayed over there at their place more than I did. And it was hard to go over there because they smoked so much, but they were just good earth, you know, salt of the earth people, both of them, just nice as they could be. And I even remember, I don't know whether he's a relative or whatnot, but he was a fiddler. And I remember him, he would come and play the fiddle. And that's kind of got me thinking about instruments and musical things. But he apparently was a professional fiddler. And in fact, Mom once told me that years later when they were going out to these things in the desert, that he would be out there and he would be playing these instruments. But he was quite the showman. He could really fiddle. I remember him very distinctly in that they made their garage into kind of a bedroom or a family room. And I remember him out there one time just fiddling. He was good. He was really good. Do you remember who that was?
I remember him, but I don't know the connection. I do know this, that
I
the
think he was
Wigginton's moved out there, and Uncle Ellis's parents lived on the other side of the duplex.
Yeah.
And so the connection would be from the Wigginton side, but how he connects, I don't know.
I think he was a cousin or a relative, an aunt, or an uncle, or somebody. He was connected to them by either marriage or lineage. I don't know. But that I remember from going over there. I remember going out with Lionel and Dale, and the day that Dale insisted we had to play Peter Pan. But that's a story. That's another story in itself, And I am trying to think. Going down to, I always like Uncle Andy and Aunt Vera. They were just, again, salt of the earth people. I can remember there was a big dirt pile in their front yard, and their grandkids were there one time, and I remember us playing in the yard, playing King of the Mountain on that big dirt pile. Do you remember that thing, that big old dirt pile?
Mm-hmm.
I can remember going to Tijuana to get haircuts,
Mm-hmm.
And they were cheap, and they were good. They gave good haircuts. It was in that environment, living that close to the border. I think it was fairly common for the family to go over the border, and for different things. I remember somebody buying a big bag of sugar.
That was Dad, because we had in '60 Cuba had fallen, '59 Cuba had fallen to Castro, and we were embargoing Cuban sugar, but Mexico did not.
So that was after we got back from Japan.
Yeah, that was after, when we were in 551 West J. So we
Yeah.
went down and we got like a 100-pound bag of sugar. It was perfectly good sugar, but not quite as thinly granulated.
Oh, it was very coarse.
Yeah, that's what I'm
Very,
talking
very
about.
coarse, but it was good sugar, yeah.
Yeah, it was perfect sugar, just not as thinly granulated. But that's what that was about.
Yeah.
Now, Grandpa was living in La Jolla at that time, and Uncle Red, they were living first in Carlsbad and then at Oceanside.
Mhm.
Of course, later we knew them in Chula Vista. Talk about Grandma and Eve and Grandpa and them.
Well, I'm trying to remember where they were living in 57, 56.
Would have been at Oceanside in '57.
Grandpa and Grandma?
No, they were in La Jolla.
Were they in that same place in La Jolla where they were at when I went in the Army in Vietnam? The same place? He started a garden in the backyard, and I remember he had a giant bird of paradise. Aunt Lizzie had one too. And I remember that he insisted he was going to educate me in the greatest of style. He gave me that whole series of Horatio Hornblower books. And, this kind of bravado sort of stuff. I expect Uncle Red got raised on it too. They want to go off and be a hero in a war somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
But I remember those, and I did read some of them, but it really didn't stick with me, I think. Not that I remember. I remember them. I remember the garden. I remember that Grandmother Eve was making designer dresses for Hollywood starlets. She was actually a well-known dressmaker within the realm of the Hollywood set. And
Under the name Evelyn Lang.
Evelyn Lang never changed her name in marriage. She
Well,
kept
professionally, yeah.
Professionally, she kept her name, Evelyn Lang. And I can remember going down to visit her, and what I loved about her is I could do anything I wanted when I was there. If I wanted to bang on a piano, I could bang on a piano. I mean, you can imagine what a kid can do to a piano noise-wise. But and then she'd bring out cookies, jarred cookies, and I could have all the cookies I wanted. Except Mom made the comment, "Well, Dennis, you notice those cookies are the burnt ones?" You know, hey, Mom, I don't think really warmed up to Grandmother Eve, is because she wasn't her natural mother. She missed her own mother, and so there was a little bit of energy there between them at that time. You know that I guess I was allowed to enjoy Grandmother Eve, but keep my eyes open, you know, kind of a thing. It's hard to put into words.
She wasn't LDS.
Oh, she wasn't LDS. A sweet person.
Well, Grandpa wasn't really LDS. He'd been baptized, but he hadn't been for years.
Yeah, hadn't been active for years. That's right.
I guess we can't possibly leave Chula Vista without talking about, you know, you go and you visit Ralph and Charlotte Garcia, and you know about the sea captain's house, so you have to go into it. Tell us about the sea captain's house.
Well, I kind of drug you into that one. I think I was curious. I went over there. How did we get in? Did we go in through a window?
There was a window on the side, and it was boarded up, but the boards had been, a couple of them had been pried loose, and a lot of kids were going in and out of that thing.
Oh yeah. Well, it was a huge, huge house, and as I understand, Disney even considered taking that house and using it for its haunted house at Disneyland. It was actually had been considered. It had been built from lumber that had been hauled around the Cape. You know, it wasn't milled locally. It was basically stuff that the sea captain had brought. And remember going into it, there was a kind of a center round period with all these kind of very kind of morose brown and dark black pictures of sailing ships, but not done in a bright way, just kind of a dark kind of silhouette pictures of sailing ships. And then I remember going up the stairs, and I remember there was a door on the stairs that was locked. You couldn't get into it. And then you could go, I don't remember how far we went up, but there was a turret way up on the top of that thing, where I guess the captain could look out over San Diego. In fact, I heard somewhere that they had taken a Japanese spy who was up there mapping the San Diego harbor and the ships in the harbor before World War II. They had actually arrested a Japanese spy from the turn of that house.
I've heard the same rumor, and I don't know the source.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Rachel did a lot of research on that thing, found out the name of the captain, the year it was built in, everything.
Really?
She had all the details. She showed them to me.
But it was spooky. It was kind of a spooky old place, of course, empty and of a very different time and of a very different style from any house we ever lived in. It was enough to give a young boy a little bit of a spice, you know.
Well, we had read while we were there, before we went to that particular time to visit Uncle, but they weren't really Uncle and Aunt, Ralph and Charlotte Garcia, and we were going to go there, and we had read an article that they're going to tear it down, that it was rumored to be haunted.
Oh, okay.
And we read that in the San Diego Union, and so we were really excited about going in. That's why we went over there. And they
So
were
we
visiting
were
Ralph and Charlotte.
motivated.
And I think Madeline was there too that time. And we went over there, and we had to sneak across the street. And Mom said, "Be careful."
Yeah, I remember that.
Okay, now September was time for us to get on a plane and go to Japan. And Aunt Lizzie drove us to San Francisco, and in our 1955 Ford. And when we got there, I'll let Dennis go ahead and tell me what you remember, not only about getting there and that, but go ahead and go on through Wake Island and Hawaii and arriving in Tachikawa.
Well, as I mentioned before, you know, we arrived actually in San Francisco and recorded there for a day or two until it was time for our flight. And we were taken out to Travis and flew out of Travis. The old DC-7s, you know, in those days, the jets now, they kind of blow through some of the lesser pockets, but in those days, those old prop planes, every downdraft, every turbulence, the planes would go up and down like this. And so I remember I say this to the camera, the barf bags in the pouch behind every seat, and I have to admit that I contributed my share. Poor Phil, he suffered. Oh, he suffered. But it was an interesting thing. We landed at it was Oneida Airport, Oneida in Japan. That's the name of the airport. And at night, it was nighttime.
Yeah, it was nice.
And we were taken in a kamikaze taxi cab from, well, that was the name of the company. It was Kamikaze Taxi, which means in Japan, divine wind. It didn't mean it's going to kill you. It was just kind of a thing. But I remember going through, it was a fairly long drive through fairly narrow streets through all these little Japanese towns at night, and it was very drab because in those days, the laws have changed in Japan. If you painted your house, you paid an extra tax for a painted house. And so the Japanese, unless you were wealthy and ready to show off your wealth, let their houses naturally weathered. They were kind of gray, brown houses, just as God made them, sort of. And that's the way they stayed. And so I remember that night going through these gray villages, one after the other, and they all looked the same that night. And the driver, he obviously knew what he was doing. It was a little scary. I don't know how it affected Mom, but for me, I was a little edged because we were on the left side of the road to begin with, and we were just moving through intersections and turns at a speed that didn't seem particularly safe to me. But so we arrived at our first house there it was in the corner where the boy Johnny and his
Johnny Moreno.
Yeah, Johnny Marino, yeah, I remember that. And he was in the corner. We were in the next house. The next morning when we got up for breakfast, Dad took us across the street onto base, hadn't been on base before, went to the mess hall, and we had our first breakfast in Japan. I remember the recombined milk that sort of tasted like milk, but sort of didn't. And I remember the eggs, which were kind of a powdered egg sort of a thing, which cooked up sort of looked like eggs, but sort of didn't. And the toast, the loaves of bread were long rectangular blocks. I mean, they didn't have much of a curve on top, and they were very, very dense bread. And I remember piles of buttered dense toast and eggs, and I can remember that recombined milk. And I can remember the checkered tablecloths on the tables. Can you remember that? They had checkered, red and white checkered tablecloths on all those tables in there. And that was our first meal in Japan.
It was the mess hall.
Yeah.
I want to kind of regress a little bit. Going to Japan, we stopped in Hawaii. It was the territory of Hawaii. It wasn't a state yet, 57. Yeah. But we made another stop, and that stop was at Wake Island. I want you to kind of talk about that because we had a delay because of a typhoon. So we had a day or so to explore. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm just going to touch a little bit on Hawaii. I remember us landing. I remember sitting in the plane and looking out the window and seeing Diamond Head. Mm-hmm. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And when we flew back, it was the same thing. We sat in the plane and saw Diamond Head. Mm-hmm. When I went to Vietnam, we sat in the plane and saw Diamond Head. And on the way back, I saw Diamond Head. I saw Diamond Head 4 times out of the stupid airplane windows before Carol and I went to Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And we actually got to go to Diamond Head. So but yeah, we landed on Wake Island. There was a typhoon going, and already we were, we were pretty tired of flying. It was a long flight. Jets move a lot faster than those old DC-6s and 7s and 8s did. And so they put us down at Wake Island, and I remember there was a little kind of a mess hall, and then there was a sleeping area. And I remember the windows were all screened for bugs. And I remember there was in front of the mess hall there was one of those Japanese long lance torpedoes. Now that I know historically what it was, but this really long torpedo was propped up in front of the mess hall. And I can remember that Phil and I took off exploring, and of course this is only 1957. The war's only been over 12 years, and it's an obscure island out in the middle of the Pacific, but they hadn't cleaned it up. It looked like the war had happened there yesterday. There was just junk everywhere, twisted metal, you know, pipe and everything else from obvious explosions. There was a ruined Type 95 Japanese tank out there, and you know, I remember I have this memory of climbing up on top of it, but I'm not sure. And looking inside of it, it looked like there was just these bats of fabric kind of all hanging loose inside of it. And I learned years later that the Japanese insulated their tanks with asbestos pads. And so that answered my question, why am I looking into this thing? But it had been knocked out in the battle. And areas restricted where you couldn't go. And right up on the beach was this torpedoed Japanese ship, which the Americans apparently torpedoed, and the Japanese skipper had run it right up on the sand to save the cargo and whatnot. But it actually, the paint on it looked pretty good. It really wasn't much rusted. It was white. You know, I mean, the name on it, Sua Maru, was just as clear as a bell. It didn't look derelict. It didn't obviously fight in the battle or anything, but there it was. And I remember right at the end of the runway, there was a wrecked Japanese Zero that they had painted it red as a runway marker. So for people landing on that airstrip, you would have come in and seen this red painted plane sitting on the end of the runway. We only stayed over like one night, I think. It wasn't for a long, long time, and then off we went to Japan and what I've already described, what I remember. But it was in the fall, and it wasn't long before I was in school. You know, it was time for school to start. Because we got there in September, and
Yeah,
and school started within days.
I remember we came in, we had that Shinto thing on the weekend, and it seemed like we went to school Monday. It seemed
Yeah,
like
it was really quick. We were in school, but yeah. So here we are. We're out in the streets, and the men are out there, and they've got their little white headbands with Japanese writing on it, and they're wearing these men's kimonos, and they've got this incredibly heavy shrine with these. They must have been 8 by 8 pieces of lumber. But they went past this shrine, and dozens of men trying to haul this thing through the street. And it must have been really heavy, and they were 3 sheets to the wind, most of them, I think.
oh yeah.
And you know, and I remember them, you know, chanting "Hoisa, hoisa, hoisa, hoisa, hoisa, hoisa, hoisa, hoisa, hoisa, hoisa," and going through the street with this giant thing. You know?
They had sake stops along the way with the little cups of sake.
That's right. That's right. So it was, and I'm not sure. I guess you could look on a Japanese calendar and see what Japanese festival came that time of year. But the thing was that every little village also had its own festival, so it might have been purely local. But I think my sense of it was it was a big Shinto shrine, is what it was.
Mm-hmm.
That in fact it was probably part of a more national sort of thing. So I remember that. I remember right at the end of our little house there was like a 2-story Japanese. They were using it as a storage shed, but it was like a pagoda.
Mm-hmm.
It went up in a little roof, and then a upstairs area, then another Japanese roof. It's quite pretty well made, but it was just being used for storage. And I remember over time, as we started to interface with the Japanese kids in the neighborhood, first the American kids, but later the Japanese kids. Phil was a great one for getting out there and playing John Ken Poi with them.
Boy,
I go to show. I go to show. And where you know which we call scissors, paper, stone, or hammer, you know, and if you lost, it wasn't enough to lose. You had to pay the price. Oh, it was more than that. You licked your finger, and then you slapped the wrist. Bam, you know, And Phil was a pretty stout little guy, bigger than most of the Japanese of his age, and I gave it to the Japanese kids. They took it well, because when we would lose, of course they'd lay a wham, itai, itai, like ouch, But when he'd do it to them, they'd almost pale with a. He was so strong, But the Japanese kids would stoically take it, boom, But you holler itai, that's the way to let off the energy. And then I remember even playing army with those. Remember when we played soldiers with them? We were upstairs in the top of this thing, and they would all charge us, and they'd holler, "Banzai! Banzai!" And they'd charge us, and we'd pretend, and then they'd be upstairs, and then so we actually were acting out their father's war there in that little pagoda. Funny, isn't it?
That had only ended 12 years before.
Yeah.
Their fathers all fought in that war.
Yeah. And,
As did ours.
Yeah, that's right. And I remember the house. The problem was in that house that to get to our bedroom, we had to go through Mom and Dad's bedroom. Remember that? The layout of the room. And so one day, I embarrassed the heck out of them coming through. I just came right through the door, right into our bedroom, And so from then on, there was kind of an understood social etiquette, because I was a little older than you, that I knocked before I went into the room, before I could go to my room, or through the funny stuff. Probably shouldn't even mention it, but
It's there for posterity now.
Yeah, it's there for posterity now. But Dad liked he'd have his airman friends over to entertain in that house, and I think that's where Phil developed some of his beverage preferences at the time.
Whoops.
But the problem was that they'd leave a mess, and in the morning us kids would come out there and be stuff laying around, and food to eat, and pretty yellow stuff in the cups to sample and taste, So we did. But I remember Airman Gay.
Yeah.
Chester Gay was his name.
Yeah, that's on here, by the way.
Is it? Dad always liked music, and Chester put together a little bit of an airman band, but they left a few hammers out of Chester's bag of hammers. He wasn't very bright, and eventually I think he got discharged from the Air Force. He just couldn't cut it. He was just not very functional, but he could play the guitar. In fact, Dad, I remember one time, put together a thing out of the football field. Do you remember that? It was a football game, and Alaska and Hawaii had just become states, and so we're out there celebrating the new statehood, and Chester Gay had his band out there playing, and they roped me into doing a couple of Elvis Presley songs, and my voice hadn't even changed. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, in celestial high notes, and other things. I remember singing a couple of Elvis Presley songs to their band. But eventually, we were in school, and it was, like you say, right away, it seemed like we were in school. I'm not sure how I got to school the first day, but I know what happened later. I would have to get on the train in Showa May, and so I would go out to the train, and we were down an alleyway. There was like an alleyway between the Takahashi tailor and the Denke, the electric shop, and right down the alleyway, it opened into this little court, and at that point our house was through the court and off to the right. Later we moved to the other side. They got us a new kerosene heater, which is a great improvement, even though the walls weren't insulated. But we eventually moved from one house to another. But I can remember later I would go out to the end of our alleyway, turn right on the main street in front of the track, go right down to the you go through a sketch of town. There were mom and pop shops right along the street, and then an open street that led to another alleyway where all the shopping was done, and where we'd go to buy our hot crackers and stuff. But I'd get on the train in the morning. I can remember in the winter time there was a woman had this great big earthen pot full of sweet potatoes, and I figured out really quick in wintertime, if I bought a piping hot sweet potato for 10 yen and put it in my jacket, it would keep me warm all the way to school, you know, and then I'd eat it for lunch or something later. But I'd get on the train, and then they'd have all these Japanese attendants who'd push you on the train if it was overcrowded. I mean they'd literally pack you in like sardines and push you in there. And in those days, the Japanese had not discovered European and American bathroom toiletries, which they loved. The Japanese men used some kind of a fish oil on their hair to slick their hair down. So once you got packed in that train, you might as well have been in a crate of sardines. It was unusual. And then I'd ride all the way Shoumei, Nakagami, Nishi Nakagami, you know, and then Tachikawa. And I'd get off at Tachikawa at the first stop, not the one to the main station. There was 2 Tachikawa stops. I would walk on base, and right there on base there was the police department, the police station, and
The APO.
yeah,
It's called the APO.
the APO, and from there we'd get on a bus, and we'd go driving across Tokyo. Long way. It was a long ride. It took us into another area which had been
Keep going.
dependent, you know, where you had Americans, dependents, living in these big kind of, it was almost like big giant apartment buildings, like first, second, third floor, people actually living in it. And right across the backside of it was Green Park School.
Yeah.
And I went to Green Park, well, I think I call it an elementary school, but I was in 7th grade.
You're in 7th grade now.
I was in 7th grade, and then when the day was done, back on the buses, all the way back across Tokyo, all the way to where they let us off, walk out the main gate, get on the train, and go home.
Yeah.
I know that one thing, you know, I really always appreciated about the Japanese is when I'd get on the train, you know, to go into school, if there was a cold going around, all the Japanese would have masks on. And they did it not only to protect themselves, but to protect the other person. And when this whole COVID thing broke and people were being total babies about wearing masks, and I remember how responsible and how considerate the Japanese were. And I give them great kudos for that. But you know, I had that bicycle that another Air Force family had brought with them when they had come from Germany, and so I bought that bicycle for $25, and it was a German-made bicycle. Somebody told me at the time it was made by a subsidiary of Volkswagen. I don't know if that's true or not, but it had, I wish I could read it today, but it had some kind of a plaque on the front of the front forks that said something like Oxenvellen Crofton or something, and so I never knew what it was really called, but it had a derailleur, it had the derailleur gears, you know, the chain jump gears.
Like a 10-speed does.
Well, here's the thing, that was before 10 speeds ever existed. In fact, the only derailleur in the world was made by a French company called Hurret, H-U-R-R-E-T, and they hadn't even hit Japan. The Japanese didn't even know about them at that point in time that I knew of, unless maybe in the international racing community. But everywhere I'd ride that bike, if I went into a Japanese bike shop to get a part or some sort of thing, and they would see that derailleur, they would just go crazy. To show, and they wanted me to jack up the bicycle by there was a kind of a carrying platform in the back, and I'd hold it up and I'd turn the thing, and they'd watch and you switch the gears and they'd watch the chain. It was a full-size chain. It wasn't a thin chain like they had on 10 speeds. It was a full-size bike chain, and the space between the 3 sprockets was quite wide. But they'd sit there and watch that thing jump, and it was like it'd bring everybody out of the house to watch that Hurret derailleur. function, and so I was a bit of a celebrity at bike shops around there. But the irony of it is that Hooray gradually, the French company gradually eclipsed, and the finest derailleurs in the world are made by Shimano in Japan now. The Japanese make them.
You might even put the idea in their head.
Oh, I doubt it. But they saw it in face to face for the first time, many, because of my bicycle. Had big 28-inch wheels, great bearings. I could outcoast anybody downhill. It was just leave everybody behind. It was a well-made bicycle. But I would ride that. I would go clear out on the rice paddies on the raised-up dikes where it was firm, and past the honey bucket pits. At the end of the rice field, there'd be these big square pits in which they'd throw the honey bucket. It would settle in, it would settle deeper in the thing, and the top would crack, and the odor would go away. And so I guess eventually they'd throw this stuff on the crops and raise it. But we were always told, don't eat the Japanese produce off the Japanese market because it's raised on human waste. It made the best vegetables. I never had a better tangerine than a Mikan, the Japanese tangerine, and undoubtedly grown on human waste. Nothing in the States ever compared. They were seedless, full body flavor, large, easy to peel. I've never seen a one that ever even came equal to it since I left Japan. But I would just go for miles out there in the paddies, and I remember I'd ride my bicycle and I'd sing, you know, Midori no kaze mo sawa ayakaru nigiru handeru kokoro mo garuku cycling, yaho yaho, oh itogani no pedal, no pedals, no choi, I can't remember the words, but basically they had the word pedals in it and all this sort of thing, and it was very, very popular at that time in the Japanese radio, and so that was my bicycling song. And later when we got on base with the bike, and my friend Jim Koprock, by that time I'd met him in junior high school. In 8th grade we'd gotten to be really good friends, but he was an officer's son. He was living on East Tachikawa, in just like a gap in the fence where you could go into another compound, like we lived in a compound in the town. They had compounds that were like right along the edges of the fence on the East Tachi, and you just went through a gate and you were in a compound. It wasn't on base, but it was off base, and later they got base housing too. But I'd go visit him, and he had a bicycle. We'd ride all the way across East Tachi, all around the end of the runway, all the way over to West Tachi, and all the way back again. And then we discovered that there was a military surplus on base on East Tachi. And also there was a photo archives, a film archives, and it had all this lovely captured film from World War II, reels and reels of it. And we'd sit there and we'd watch this stuff, and then we'd go back, and he designed tanks and stuff out of balsa wood, and he was really good at it. I learned gradually, but we'd make tanks, and his father had flown flying jugs with P-47s in World War II, and his father had worked in an aviation factory before the war in Buffalo, New York, and so he was really good at making gliders and stuff, and so he had taught Jim how to do that, and I'd get to watch them do it together. And so I got interested in making all sorts of airplanes and scratch models and stuff. So we went everywhere. One point in time, Jim buys a surplus parachute. On a windy day, I don't know, we were out of our mind. We're on West Tachi at the edge of the airfield, the runway, and Jim unfolds this thing, and it begins to drag us right across the apron of the airport. The next thing you know, here comes eight apes, air police, in jeeps, and they're helping us pull this thing in, and he gets all chewed out, and I get all chewed out. I never told Mom and Dad about that, you know. But Mrs. Koprock remembered it when we had lunch with her one time. But so we could get into trouble if we wanted to. So we took to doing tow gliders, where we'd make these big beautiful balsa wood gliders, and right on the front there'd be a hook, and then we'd put a ring on that tied to a string, and then we'd start pedaling our bicycles. And as long as we kept up speed and didn't let the string slack, it would get way, way up there. And then you'd let the string slack, and then you'd have to chase this thing from all over the place. I mean, we lost one, I remember, but some of these, we must have gone several kilometers to catch it before it finally came down. And then we got to making indoor gliders, where you took really thin strips of balsa wood and you poured nail polish on water, and it would make a film. And then we'd lift that film and put it on the frames and made these really light gliders. I mean, you toss them and they almost wouldn't move, they just kind of hang there. And we'd make these and see how far they would go before they touched ground. You know, so I had a lot of, that was one of the best and really only good friend I ever had in the Air Force. Not the Air Force, but during the Air Force period, was Jim Coprock. In fact, in my book, I have a letter that I had written to him when they went back to the States, and he never answered me, but his mother had kept that letter, and she gave it back to me, the letter I wrote Jim Coprock from Florida, when we were in Florida. So I had a really good friend, and by the time I got into junior high school, life was looking better. We had a teacher who was actually a nice guy. He'd been wounded on Iwo Jima. He'd been a Marine, and his jaw had been blasted off. And they left him for dead on the field. He was trying to holler at people, but he couldn't make any noise. And eventually they discovered he was alive, and they made him an artificial jaw, and they gave him skin. You could see the separation of the color of the skin on his jaw. But he was my 7th grade teacher. And he was also we had all the kids from the choir in one class. That meant that anytime we could get up and go and travel. But after lunch, he would turn down the lights, and we had painted on the windows at Green Park Saturns and the moon and spaceships and all this stuff that were put on the windows, and he did most of that. And he would read Ray Bradbury and stuff to us over after lunch until lunch settled, and then we'd go back into classes. But suddenly school started to look interesting. It started to suck me in again. At that point, I had been totally turned off. I wasn't there in school. You know, I think my teachers used to say, Dennis seems to be very bright, but he daydreams all day. Well, I wasn't daydreaming, I was checked out, period. Just checked out of school. But it became kind of neat. At that point, I started to get kind of interested in girls, and all the girls in there were all in the choir with us. You know, we're the boys in the choir. And so we would go on these excursions. We'd get on a bus. We went downtown to the Ginza, and this famous restaurant where they had various levels of menu on the various, and we got to go there up to about the 34th level. And I remember I bought a Coca-Cola for Arlene Martin, who was my heartthrob at that point. And we were there to sing. The choir sang up there on that floor in Tokyo. And then they took us down to Kamakura. And I remember all the choir right in front of the Buddha in Kamakura, and we sang. The whole choir sang in front of the Kamakura Buddha. I remember going up inside the Buddha, all the way up inside, looking out through the Buddha's eyes and that kind of stuff. And then they took us to the most prestigious Siaki restaurant in Tokyo, and we had been invited there to play. And so we sang. The choir sang in this sukiyaki restaurant in Tokyo. So I was starting to get a little bit of a different view of Japan, you know, from and mostly through the choir. And then again, I was in the 8th grade in choir, and then I think they intended to cancel it, but as I recall, it ended up happening after all, and I was in choir most of 8th grade too. And then when I started high school, I started choir again in Japan. So I had almost 2¼ years of choir before I ever got to high school.
That was Yamato High School.
Yeah, Yamato High School, but that's a little later story. So, but we would sit on the bus because of that huge bus ride across Tokyo, and we'd sing all those songs that kids sing when they're bored on a bus ride. It's nearly 45 minutes, you know. They say that in the army the chicken's mighty fine. One jumped up off the table and killed a friend of mine. Oh, I want no more of Army or Air Force life. You know, gee, Mom, I want to go, not back to Tokyo. Gee, Mom, I want to go home. Or I wish I was a little bar of soap. I'd go slippy, slippy, slidey over everybody's hidey. Remember that? We sang them all, and there was a black kid. He would sit right up front with me, and we would sing harmony. We would come up with these old songs and just sing harmony to the top of our lungs, joyously sing to the top of our lungs. So I remember it as a time that I started to wake up to the world, started to come out of my shell, started to come out of myself, you know. And the only drawback was, well, Yamato High School was a lot closer than going across Tokyo to go to Green Park. But it was kind of a back road to it. It had been a Japanese, believe it or not, a tank factory in World War II. And there was these huge concrete ramps that went out from the main building where they'd driven these things out and loaded them onto trucks, you know. And I remember that all the boys, we got together in PE, and the coach had a Volkswagen. And we lifted that Volkswagen, put it up on top of one of these concrete ramps. And so when the coach came out, there's this Volkswagen up on the car. Who did this? Who did? You know, a certain amount of mischievousness. But then I was a freshman, and there was one boy who decided that he needed his freshman to pick on. He was a senior, and his name was Perkins. And so I remember him. He decided that anytime he'd see me, he'd want to slap me around, you know. And I didn't like it. I would resist. I'd put up my hands, but he'd still slap me around. He was so much bigger than me. And I remember him saying to me, "Yeah, Wheeler thought it was such a big wheel till he found out that squares don't roll." You know? And so I finally decided, okay, well, I'm tired of being slapped around. But he had a girlfriend. He finally got a girlfriend. And so anytime he'd come by me, and I knew he wanted to slap me around, I'd charge him. I'd go windmilling into him, you know, and whatnot. Of course, he knocked me away. But once I did that a couple of times with his girlfriend there, he decided it was uncool for his girlfriend to see this freshman attacking him, you know. And so that ended that. So he quit doing that. Perkins quit doing that. But I don't know why well, maybe it was the only place they could have built a school, but it was built right next to a crematorium, a Japanese crematorium. And they get that thing fired up by about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And it always smelled like really kind of sweet roast pork. And if I brought a tuna fish sandwich or a peanut butter sandwich, all my sandwiches taste like sweet pork. and it was true for all the kids at Yamato High School, right by the crematorium. You know, when you ate lunch, you tasted burnt pork.
Not fun.
Not fun, but that was one of the funny points that I remember there. I can remember going to UNESCO Village. That was interesting. You remember the ice cream at UNESCO Village? You were eating that?
I remember eating ice cream. Was there something about it? I don't remember anything.
Well,
other than
it
was
didn't
ice cream.
taste like American ice cream. It was made with agar-agar, which they use as a kind. You know what agar-agar is?
Yeah, it's a gelatin used in petri dishes too.
Yeah. And so Japanese ice cream had a very unique flavor, but I can remember eating agar-agar ice cream. It was funny because when I got in the Army, we were molding dentures out of agar-agar. It gels into a really solid clump, you know, and you can mold with it. But I remember Japanese ice cream. I remember just so many little details like that. And that first year in high school, one of the families is coming to school. There was an airman and his daughter, and then the twins, the daughter of another airman, Suzanne and the Guido girls. Suzanne was the one I knew really well. They were twins, beautiful girls. But when you came to the Japanese railroad crossing, oftentimes these hedges would come right down to the railroad tracks. And so they put these mirrors at the corners of the hedges so you could see if a train was coming. Well, that morning, the mirrors were all fogged.
Oh, no.
And he went out into it, and the train hit the car, and Susan was flung out of the car, hit a telephone pole, broke her neck, killed her on the spot. And that was really hard because Susan sat right behind me. In fact, when it came time to go to the freshman dance, she didn't have enough money, and so I lent her money so she could go. I mean, and we were pretty close friends. I ran into her sisters at the Yamato reunion in Las Vegas back in 2007 or whatever it was, and as a courtesy, I danced with her. We talked a little bit about that, and she said, "Yeah, I remember going through Susan's letters and saying how nice you were to lend her the money when she didn't have money that day to go to the dance." You know, but by that time I was a pretty good photographer. I was getting better. It was great because it was over on the east side. It was a kind of a hobby center thing for airmen, and you could go in there. There was a total dark room. You could develop your own pictures. They supplied the paper, the chemicals, and when you shot a roll of film, they had a reloading machine that you could reload your cartridges. And so by that time, Jim Koprock and I got really pretty efficient at photography, and so I had a picture that I'd taken of Susan, and so I printed it up and just handed it all around the student body that people who wanted to remember her by. I remember I produced dozens and dozens of pictures of Susan for all the students. And for kids that age, freshman high school, very impressionable when you lose a classmate, and they were well liked, the twins. It was a crusher. It just crushed the whole attitude. But it wasn't long after that we were on our way back to the States, and that was kind of the end. And the Weedo family, after they lost their daughter, he was immediately sent back to the U.S. with his family to bury her back home where she was. So those are some of the really strong memories that I recall. Yeah, that was probably the most formative time in my life musically, because my voice was changing, but I had a pretty good voice, and I got to sing one solo. I had one solo in the choir, and it was, how'd that go? If everyone lit just one little candle, no, that's not how it started. It is better to light just one little candle than to stumble through the dark. Better yet that you light just one little candle, all you need's a tiny spark. If we'd all say a prayer that the world would be free, a beautiful dawn of a new day we'd see. And if everyone lit just one little candle, what a bright world that would be. And that was my one solo that I sang in that choir in Japan. But but you know, back at home, back in Shohei, you mentioned fireworks. The only thing about Japanese fireworks was that it was hard to find them with fuses. They all had this match head tips on them. And so you struck them against a matchbox, and then you threw them. But 1 in 20 or 1 in 30, you strike it, boom, you go off right in your hand. It wasn't a real powerful thing, but I'd go around for days with this finger and this inside of my thumb turn sulfur yellow, and it wouldn't wash out. And they'd just throb from doing that. And so I got to be a little cautious at the end. But you could buy 3 green glass marbles for $1, which was less than a third of a penny, and you could buy firecrackers of the medium size for $1 a piece. But the glass marbles were just nothing. And I can remember taking bottles, regular glass bottles. I must have been out of my mind, but I would take one of those green marbles that would just fit into a Japanese bottle, and drop a small firecracker into the bottle, jam the glass bead in, and aim it at the wall at Club Katie. Boom! It would go off, and that marble, it would shatter the marble on the wall and never blew up the bottle. I got to thinking back, was I crazy? You know, that could have, who knows what that could have done, but that was one of my, and then I remember when we got on base one time, dropping a cherry bomb in a trash can and watching the lid go up into the air, you know, but most of the time I was pretty well behaved. But one of the things I thought was really special, I'd go to the BX, they call it Base Exchange, and they were selling models like the Lindbergh models, which were 99 cents in the States, were 79 cents. And I was buying. Remember, I bought a model of a Panther tank, and then I bought a model of a Japanese. But what was really cool, when we first got to Japan, mostly people were making models with you take a piece of bamboo and you put it over a candle and you bend it to make a wing shape, and you'd actually build things out of paper and bamboo. But the Japanese started making their own plastic models. The very, very first Japanese plastic models that came out, I got to build them. And I had a Japanese Zero that was 1/24 scale, had a wingspan like this and about this long, and it was a really thick molding. I mean, they didn't, like modern models have a rather thin, they're thin, but this thing was heavy duty, but the outside details was really good. It looked really good. And then more and more started to come. So I got to start to build the very first generation of Japanese plastic models, which added to the American models, kind of opened up my interest in more and more model building. And Jim Koprock was not a whit behind me on that. He and I were both building models. In fact, if you look through my book, there's a picture that his mother sent us of some of the models that we built that she had kept after Jim died at age 17, was a student at San Jose State. That she had kept these pictures, and when I was talking to her about it one time, she went through the stuff and actually found and dug out a model that Jim had. Yeah, here's the picture. Oh, here's the letter I sent to Jim Koprock from. He was still in Japan, from Patrick Air Force
Something's
Base.
about ready to fall off.
Oh, more pictures, probably for cars. And then down below are models that Jim and I built, that he had saved pictures of. There's pictures of the Panther tank, and there's also pictures of some of the balsa wood tanks he built. So that was probably, and so those are probably some of the sweetest memories I have is my friendship with Jim and all the creative things we were doing. And my school started to really open up when I was in the choir, singing, which I enjoyed, with a teacher who was a very understanding man. And suddenly teachers weren't awful ogres anymore. They became human beings, and that's probably the best part of Japan. Coming back, going to Florida was a revelation in itself.
Cheryl was born on October the 18th, 1959, and of course that was just one day off of your birthday. Her due date was actually the 20th, and so talk about Cheryl.
Well, I remember how tiny she was, a newborn baby. I remember what our Japanese maid said, which today you wouldn't say. She says, "Oh, American baby, so beautiful. Japanese baby look like monkeys." But American babies look, beautiful. So the maid thought she was gorgeous. She was gorgeous, and Cheryl Beauvais went back to the States shortly after that. Cheryl Beauvais was statuesque. She had long brown hair, very pretty girl, very, very pretty girl, and I was just totally smitten with her. And of course, then it's not very, very long before we're headed back to the States. But specific memories about Cheryl in terms of being a baby, not really. I have memories of Mike and Neil playing. I have memories of you. And you still had that, if I'm not mistaken, you still had that Hopalong Cassidy shirt in Japan. Is that true?
I think I might have had it at the beginning, but not at the end.
Not at the end. It eventually wasn't there anymore, yeah. And I remember that we would go out with the Sewells,
And the Johnstons?
Johnson, and we'd go out in the way out in the Japanese countryside, and we'd have picnics out with our old Plymouth car, off the back of the station wagon, and those lovely old Japanese farmhouses. Our second house in Japan, my bedroom window framed Mount Fujiyama. And I remember even drawing the sketch of Mount Fujiyama, but it was kind of an elongated, and in the morning, there was Mount Fujiyama, right, framed like a picture in my window, and I'd watch in the wintertime. It was snowier in the summertime. For that period of time, that was my picture on the wall was Mount Fujiyama, kind of a, and that kerosene heater, you know, getting that thing lit in the morning, getting it going. And I had to leave for school really, really early, but as soon as that thing was lit in the morning, I used to love just curl myself, lay on the floor around that stove and warm myself up real good before I had to go off to school. I still like to lie by a heater to get heated up in the morning. I'll lie by this heater in the hallway. But that's a habit I developed in Japan, warming up to go to school around that old, it was a brand new kerosene heater. And then they put tinfoil on the walls, so, because they weren't insulated, to reflect the heat back into the house. Do you remember the tinfoil on the walls in those houses? It was, yeah, they were, between the studs, they were stapled right all around the furnace. There was foil to reflect the heat back into the house. Yeah.
We didn't have much in the way of a newspaper. You know, you had the Stars and Stripes, and it was like a bi-weekly newspaper. But once a week, the top 20 hits from the States would be played on Armed Forces Radio. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, and of course things were changing. The Air Force is pretty conservative, so a lot of the stuff we were getting was the end of the big band era, you know, and stuff like Doris Day and all this stuff, and you know, and how much is that doggy in the window, that kind of stuff. But some of the early rock and roll was starting to creep on, although we had already been hearing it in the States. You know, and I remember I went to Tachikawa East, to the little base theater. It was right next to the hospital where Mom was when she had her surgery on Tachi East, for the first Elvis Presley film, which Love Me Tender. And so I made the mistake. I go in there and I sit down in the front row in this theater, and all around me are girls. There's girls on this side of me, girls on this side, girls in the 2 rows behind me, and the movie's getting ready to start. Elvis comes on in that opening scene. They start screaming. I didn't hear the dialogue until I was probably 15 minutes into the picture, for all the girls screaming for Elvis around me as I'm watching this thing. Love me tender, you know, and all that stuff. And they just went ballistic, you know. Ah, funny stuff. Funny stuff.
Yeah.
And then that cousin of Mom's, who took so good care of Mom in the hospital. I mean, he did everything he could to take care of her, and.
Carl Pratt was his name. He was Lily Pratt's son.
Yeah, and I remember going to his funeral years later.
Okay, in April of 1960, we went to Florida. We actually drove back there, and Dennis, tell us what you remember about going there and getting there, and maybe even without me prompting anymore, coming home.
Well, I remember Dad was, like always, was in a hurry to get there. I mean, he drove night and day through portions of that. I remember driving at night, but I do remember the trip back. I think I remember best, it was just sitting way in the back and singing. Phil and I would sing, and we sang quite a bit going back to Florida. I remember coming through those really sleepy little southern towns on the way into Florida, and that was before the Civil Rights Act, you know, and racism was still really endemic in the South, and everywhere you looked there was the signs, you know, that blank, don't let your blank be caught after dusk in town, you know. I mean, very, very graphic. All the little restaurants along the way, you'd see a sign nailed on the building with an arrow pointing to the back, you know, blacks to the back. Blacks get their food in the back. A lot of that sort of stuff, but I had never seen that before, and by that time I was probably nearly 15 or so, and somewhat aware of things. And so, but I think the really hard thing for me was going back to junior high school after being in high school. What a come down. So I'm in Indian River, Was it Indian River Junior High School?
Said O'Galley here, but I'm not sure if it was.
Well, maybe that was. I thought it was Indian River, but.
Well, it probably was. It was your school, not what Mom wrote.
Yeah, and going there, and then going into high school, which is Melbourne High School. I remember my first time suiting up for PE in Melbourne High School, and I'm sitting in the bleachers. We're waiting for the coach to come out, and there's two older boys about two bleachers up from me, and they're talking about what they did on Saturday, and they had gone to a black cemetery where there'd been somebody recently interred, had dug him up, had tied chains to his ankle, and drug him through N Town for sport on Saturday night. And and to me that was just appalling. I could not imagine somebody doing that to somebody. But it became really clear. I remember going into Sears Roebuck's in Orlando, and I'm thirsty, and I see a drinking fountain. I go to the drinking fountain to drink, and then I hear somebody kind of snickering. I look over, a couple of white guys pointing at me and snickering because I'm drinking in the colored drinking fountain, and they were at the white drinking fountain, and there were several black people behind me, kind of their heads down like this, while these guys berated me for drinking from the N drinking fountain, and they just stood there and took it while these guys berated them. So I knew right away that I was in a different place, and it just.
Go ahead.
Academically, I kind of was being challenged a bit there because there were so many of the children of the Cape Canaveral brain set that were in Melbourne High School. I guess they got together and demanded that they up the curriculum. So they introduced this experimental, it was called GSCS biology program that was supposed to upgrade the education their kids were getting. And it was so far ahead of California when we finally got back to California that biology in California was child's play. For one time in my life, I was actually ahead of the curve. But again, I remember the teacher going through the groups and talking about pure race, pure white race. He goes through all the kids, and he gets to me with my blue eyes, and he gets excited. He turns to the other student and says, "This is a perfect example of unadulterated race." And he points to my blue eyes. So when I hear stuff coming out of Florida today, I said, well, no wonder. I know where this, because those people were backwards as far as racial ideas and equality of man, children of God. How that was not in their vocabulary. It was a very racist society and even with the intelligentsia working at Cape Canaveral, they were just a pocket in a sea of endemic racism.
I was very young when we went back there, but it became very apparent when you went around to go to the restroom. There'd be one that said male and there'd one that said female, and they were nice and they were clean and they had a door. Then it would say colored or black or just however they did
Colored
it.
is how they said it in those days.
And then that one, the door might not even be on anymore. Yeah. And looking inside, the porcelain of the toilet might be broken.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, well, why don't they fix that? And I didn't realize that it wasn't something they wanted to fix. It was a point they were making. They were trying to put those people in their place. And I thought, how awful. Yeah. But I was only 12. In fact, I was only 11 at the time.
Yeah. Well, for me, it smacked me right between the eyes. I felt it. I felt the weight of it, especially after I got ridiculed in that Sears and Roebuck's, and saw the blacks just hunker down under it, just hunker down. Don't move, don't smile, don't do nothing, hunker down. As a white man gets called out, and all the other epithets they had to throw at me that day. But I remember, like you did, talking about the beach. The beach, gee, you went from our house, which is kind of at the end of the little court, to the street, the next street over, and then you were at the beach. I mean, you were climbing the sand dunes to the ocean. You were right there, practically on the ocean. And I remember those horseshoe crabs.
Those are ugly things.
Ugly things, but there'd be times, there was a time of the year when the beaches were covered as far as you could see with them, just everywhere. Millions on millions of horseshoe crabs would wash up on the beach. And then if you went to the other side, I remember the time when all of a sudden all the green frogs hatched. Do you remember that? We had,
After a rain,
after rain, all those tiny little green
they
frogs.
were on the sidewalks and grass.
Everywhere. You could not take a step without stepping on one unless you took and nudged them aside. They were so thick, all these little green frogs. And those cockroaches, they called them water bugs back there, but they were as big as the cockroaches I saw in Vietnam, some of them things, you know. And so you had, and then you had coral snakes out there. I never saw one, but you always warned about the coral snakes and different things. But Dad had all this leftover fishing gear that he'd brought. This company had given him all these samples, but Dad didn't end up selling fishing gear, but they had given him a lot of samples, and so there were treble hooks in there. And so somebody clued me in if you wanted to fish certain kinds of fish. I'm trying to think of the name.
Mullet would be the one.
Mullet, that's
Because
it.
you'd snag mullet.
That's right. If you just go out there and you throw your line out there and just reel it as fast as you could into a school of mullet, and you'd snag one if you were lucky. And I remember snagging mullet. I remember going to the Ward fish fries. They'd have them out on the causeway, right off the causeway, and you'd have fish fried, and then you'd have those what do they call those little round balls?
Hush puppies.
Hush puppies, yeah. And those were tasty. They were a little peppery, but they were very tasty. I remember eating more hush puppies than I should have, because they were fried food and they were really delicious, in the fish. And those were nice sociable times. I think that's partly why Dad really began to turn in his attitude. Because I remember him as a young person thinking, saying something to the effect that Californians are kind of stuffy, But when he got back to Florida, he went to church, and half the guys didn't have ties on. Y'all come, welcome, that kind of stuff. And they were speaking Dad's language. And boy, did he suddenly, it worked for him. Suddenly, the church, the values, and the people came together for him. And I could see that was a really formative time in his life when he got to experience the church among Southern boys. It was a real game changer. And I think may have really set the stage for what became his constancy later, as he moved into another phase of his life. And I remember, well, not only was it you take there was the ocean, there was this long strip of island that paralleled the coast, there was the Indian River and the other rivers,
Banana River.
and then there was the mainland and Melbourne, but on this thin strip you went almost to the end of it, and right where it turned to go across the causeway, they had built a McDonald's. And that's the first from McDonald's that I remember seeing. And it said something like, "We have served 1 million hamburgers." Now they've served 20 billion. Who knows how many hamburgers they've served since then. And
They still have that sign too that tells you how many.
yeah, they do. They do. And going across the causeway, going to school, I ran into some kids in that little short sketch that I was in 9th grade that were also model builders, and one of them actually lived a couple blocks from where we were living in Patrick. And so I remember going over to his house, and he'd built all sorts of planes and painted them up, and he was pretty good, but at the time I found somebody who liked models. But they liked to give Nazi salutes and stuff to each other, he and his friend, There was a southern kind of right-wing save your Confederate money, the South will rise again mentality that was being blended with kind of a Nazi attitude. And it was foreign to me. I didn't really relate to it very well. But I do remember going to Orlando to conference, and it was so hot and so muggy. I mean, it just sweat would form on your body and just stay there. It wouldn't evaporate off. And I remember the women folk with these fans through the congregation. There'd be dozens, I won't say hundreds, but dozens of people with these fans fanning themselves through conference because the heat was so oppressive. And right at the coast where we were living, it wasn't that bad. But if you went in 40 miles inland, the heat was just, it was just hung on you like a wet blanket. But I remember going to that farm, that Ellsworth farm, and I remember weeding. I remember helping to nail, if I remember right, it was honeycombs, nailing honey for bees.
Well, there was two places. One was the Ellsworth Ranch, and then the other one was the place out there where they had the church project where we actually, honey was what we were providing.
Well, I remember actually trying to assemble boxes, honeycomb, beehives. That's the word I'm looking for. And I also remember the palmetto bushes that you could pull it was about a 3 or 4 inch piece out of the top and eat it.
Yeah, I remember eating those.
You know, I think back on that now, it probably killed the bush every time you took its flower. I don't know if it did or not, but it's related to a pineapple. It's actually a distant relative of a pineapple. But I remember just eating dozens of those things in the course of working through the day.
We sure did. I remember doing that too.
Do you? And that's pretty much. I remember I would go out on the beach, and
You didn't mention the Portuguese man o' war. You mentioned some of the other stuff, the horseshoe crabs and the.
Yeah.
But remember the Portuguese man o' war, the blue bubble thing with the red
and blue bubble with the tentacles. Yeah, the tentacles would sting you badly. You had to be really careful with them. Now they use the blue blood from the horseshoe crabs. Apparently it's turned out to be a very powerful medicine for certain kinds of cancers, I think, or something. So it's actually found medical use for it. But I remember going and sitting on the beach because I heard that they were going to launch the first, they built an underwater platform, and this was the Polaris missile that they were later to put on the submarines. You know, the Polaris submarines would have these nuclear things, and so the first test of a Polaris missile was done on an underwater platform. I heard about it, I went and sat on the beach and waited until I watched that Polaris break the surface of the water and watched the Polaris missile launch. And then I remember watching the Able and the Baker monkey launches. You know, Hammer monkey, Able, there were two of them, this Able launch and Baker launch. I remember those. And then Dad hired me to clean the billeting officers' quarters.
Yeah, BOQ.
And so I learned to master one of those great big buffers, those giant hallway buffers they used in those days. If you lean them this way, they go slam into the wall. You lean this way, they go slam into the other wall. And so it was real subtle. You had to know how to. And I learned to wax and buff the halls. And then I was learning to make the beds. I was making the beds for that first. Pardon?
Square corners.
Yeah, for that first generation of test pilots that were down there, many who were to become that first generation of astronauts.
Yeah, the Mercury.
Yeah, I was making their beds and cleaning their rooms, and throwing all sorts of unimaginable trash away, and I even, out of indignation, I was throwing their Playboy magazines away. These old hotshot pilots, you know, they had all this stuff, and I can remember doing that. I can remember coming back from work one afternoon around the end of the runway, and there's a strange plane on the runway. It's got these really, really long wings. And me, you know, I'd studied planes, I knew, but I didn't know this one. It was really odd. So I stopped my bicycle and watched this thing take off, and it'd go down the runway, and it's practically dragging the wingtips. And as it lifts off, I saw little wheels drop off the ends of the wings. And it wasn't until much later that I put two and two together and realized that was a U-2 I watched. But it was right at dusk, you know, it was almost dark. And they wheeled that thing out there and off it went. Probably spying on Cuba. Probably flew
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, in
Yeah,
fact.
that kind of stuff, yeah.
A&W root beer, that was maybe something that was more Cheryl's thing, but we used to stop by that on the way home from church.
Yeah, I remember that. And I started thinking something, and I lost it. Yeah, I had something in my mind, and I lost it. guy. Well, I guess that's gone. It's gone.
Well, occasionally, that fellow that worked with you would not be there, and I a couple of times went down and worked in the BOQ myself. I don't know if you remember that. It was
No,
about twice.
No, I don't.
Because there was another fellow that worked with you. It was your age.
Yeah, he was a Southern boy, you know, and he was kind of a lanky. You know, every time I see like a Ernest P. Worrell, he looked like Ernest P. Worrell, kind of lanky Southern boy, kind of stupid, but yeah, he was a ringer for Ernest P. Worrell.
Mhm.
I remember him very well.
Yeah, Dad sent me down there. I doubt that I did very much to help you, but I figured it was better than you being alone, because I was not quite 12.
Well, I got mad at Dad over something, and I said, I quit. He said, okay. And so I quit, and I went home, and I mulled over it for a day or so, and I came back to Dad, you know, mea culpa, I'm sorry, Dad. And he shouldn't have maybe, but he hired me back after a couple of days. And then the neighbors next door, the girl next
The
door.
Kirbys.
She was kind of cute. But
She was your age, and Gerald Kirby was mine.
Yeah, she was kind of cute, and I think I had a little bit of steam going there. But their family had just been stationed in Turkey. And do you remember that? They'd been just
I
stationed
didn't.
in Turkey, and so they had come. There was, I guess, a rather large Air Force contingent in Turkey at that time, and so she had some records of Turkish music and stuff, and I remember she played them for me. I remember, İskidara, Nezuldaş gumlik, Nezuldaş yarasu. İskidara, Nezuldaş gumlik, Nezuldaş yarasu. İskidara, Yaldaş blinken, Nezuldaş yarasu. İskidara, you know, it was something like that.
Uh-huh.
But it was Turkish music, and I'd never heard Turkish music, so I thought that was kind of fun, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But that didn't go anywhere. She wasn't interested in me, but she thought she was cute, and she did share her record collection with me.
Mm-hmm. We didn't have any TV, just as we hadn't in Japan. So occasionally we'd go over and watch a little TV with them. I remember I'd watch like Davy Crockett or Zorro or Swamp Fox or something like that there. It was the only TV I had seen in 4 years.